Good morning everyone. This is Bharat from 6th standard. They all are my classmates. Today we stand before you to present science seminar. Our topic is methods of separation. We know that here we go. We know that many substances that we use are found as mixtures. The components can be obtained easily from separating from the mixtures. There are two types of separations: physical methods and chemical methods. Centrifugation. The example of this method is separation of butter from milk. Over to my friend Yoga Prasanna.
Hand picking. Example of this method is separation of stones from pulses.
Sieving.
Example of this method is separation of small insects from rice flour.
Winnowing, separation of the grain from the chaff.
Threshing. The example of this method is separation of grain from the starch.
Separating funnel. The example of this method is separating from oil and water.
Evaporation. This example of method is common salt from seawater. Chromatography. The example of this method is the separation of pigments from leaves and flowers.
Decantation. The example of the method is separation of water contaminated with sand.
Sedimentation. Example of this method is separation of water from muddy water.
Distillation. Example of this method is purification of well water to remove dissolved solid impurities.
Condensation. The example of this method is dewdrops form on this grass during an winter season.
Hand picking. The example of this method is separation of fresh fruits from rotten fruits.
Threshing.
The example of this method is
The example of this method is
separation of grains
separation of grains
from stalk.
from straw.
Separating funnel. The example of this method is separation of oil and water. Sublimation.
The example of this method is
The example of this method is separation of common salt
from ammonium chloride.
ammonium chloride.
Blood pressure 120/80.
Sublimation. The example of this method is the mixture of common salt and ammonium chloride. We hope you learned something from this seminar. Thank you. Have a truthful Tuesday.